Okay. Everyone, you ready? Okay. I want to talk about 2 days Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael. It's the only Yom Tov that Eretz Yisrael Israelis have 2 days Yom Tov, so it's unique in that way. I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, just as by way of a background, before there was Sephardim and Ashkenazim, before there was all the Sephardim and Ashkenazim, probably I would say are 95% alike, something to that effect. And then there's like the 5% that's, I'm not talking culturally, I'm talking about like actual halacha, bottom line halacha, 95% alike, and maybe, 5% that's distinction in halacha between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Now, before there was Sephardim and Ashkenazim, there was something called Minig Eretz Yisrael and Minig Bavel. As Klal Yisrael was beginning to splinter apart into 2 different distinct groups, they developed different Minig Eretz Yisrael and Minig Bavel. You'll even see certain times little wisps of it will still make it to the Paiskim today. Like the Marshal Lamashal talks about, he has a list, in the end of Bava Kama I think it is, of the Chilukim Shabim Bavel Eretz Yisrael. In the Chashchita there's a few Chilukim Shabim Bavel Eretz Yisrael. Here and there you'll see a wisp of this like old Minig dispute between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. Now, Minig Eretz Yisrael itself is a little bit hard to nail down. It's hard to know what Minig Eretz Yisrael is or was anymore. Because Eretz Yisrael, even though after the Churban Jews lived there for hundreds of years, all the way through the Tkufas HaGa'inim, in the Tshuvas HaGa'inim you'll see many Shayalim from Eretz Yisrael, not Meishivim, because the Great Yeshivas were in Bavel already, in Surah and Pumbedisa and Arda, all the Yeshivas were there. So the Tshuvas are always coming from Bavel, but the Shailas a lot of times could come from Eretz Yisrael or from the areas around Eretz Yisrael. So there still existed like a Kehillah that would be called Minig Eretz Yisrael, all the way until the year 1096. In 1096 is when the Crusaders reached Eretz Yisrael. So we know about the Crusaders be'ikr from the perspective of being in Europe, meaning all our history is full of what the Crusaders did to the whole Rhineland, how they completely devastated, Magenza and Worms and Ramaiza, and they devastated the places where Ashkenazi Jews lived. They wiped out entire towns and villages, and wave after wave of Crusaders as they organized and got ready to go to Eretz Yisrael to capture the land from the Muslims, decimated Jewish communities in Europe. And we know about the Crusaders, Kilo, from their effect on the European front. But in 1096 is when the first, actual strong crusade reached Eretz Yisrael. And as expected, they set up siege on various different, Jewish kehillas that were in all these different towns. And Lamashal in Yerushalayim, they put all the Yidden in a shul and burnt it to the ground. In Haifa, they did the same thing. In Caesarea, they did the same thing. They left a few shirayim behind from these different kehillas and sent them to Akko, which became late like a Crusader headquarters, a Crusader fortress. And but overall, they decimated the entire kehillah in Eretz Yisrael during that kufa. Now, so at that point in 1096 is when Minig Yerushalayim kind of came to like Minig Eretz Yisrael came to like an abrupt stop. There was really no kehillah left that would be practitioners of Minig Eretz Yisrael. There was nothing more left over there. So now the rest of the Goyla, be it Ashkenazim or Sephardim or what they were, are more or less feeding off the Minig Bavel, Be'ikr. And like we know, Talmud Bavli is the main primary source for everything that's all our Minhagim, Ashkenazim or Sephardim. And that's more or less how it broke down. Now, so shortly after that, not too long after that, in a strange historical episode, 300 Baalei Tosafos from France and England made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. This is like in the year 1210 or 1212, I think. 1212, I think, is the year. 300 Baalei Tosafos collected from England and from France and from Provençal parts of France made a joint Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael together with a great chavivas for Eretz Yisrael, and they moved up to Eretz Yisrael. Now, it's interesting to note that the Gemara in Ksuba says that if a spouse wants to force his other spouse to go up to Eretz Yisrael, he's allowed to. Meaning, hakol kaifin to go up to Eretz Yisrael. But Tosafos brings B'Shem Rabbeinu Chaim Kayin, who was the Talmud Rabbeinu Tam, that Bizman Hazer Rabbeinu Chaim Kayin says, since there's such danger on the roads and it's so unstable in Eretz Yisrael, this din isn't true anymore. You're not able to be kaifin to go to Eretz Yisrael because it's considered Shas Sakana. So it's interesting that in Tosafos that we have, on the Shas, Tosafos seems to be of the opinion that going to Eretz Yisrael is not the advisable route at that juncture in history. But Lamaisa, shortly after that Tosafos was written, from the Chaverim of the Talmidei Rabbeinu Tam and Talmidei Ari, a large kvutza, 300 people, is a tremendous kvutza in those days, made the dangerous and extensive trip up from France and England to Eretz Yisrael. Now, we know of them from like snippets here and there. A lot of them made the trip through Egypt, where they met Rabbi Avram ben Arambam. The Rambam wasn't alive anymore, but they met Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, the Rambam's son, and Malamakim, who writes that he met them, he discussed them, and he was impressed by their godless Batera. Others didn't come that direction, they went other ways, and we know about them from small little details. There's a story of which very few details are known, but it says when the Baalei Tosafos came, they were nena on rain. It seemed to have been a drought, and the local ruler asked these arriving Baalei Tosafos to daven for rain. They did so, and they were nena. And this brought them some brownie points, some credit by the local ruler. For one of the main leaders of this aliyah was Rabbi Yonasan Milunel. I wouldn't call him Baalei Tosafos. One of the Provincial Rishonim, Rabbi Yonasan Milunel. He's famous because he corresponded with the Rambam extensively, and he was big in the fight over the Sifrei Rambam that happened in that era. He was a big supporter and defender of the Rambam, and he's famous from that. Now there are those who suggest even that the reason why this aliyah of the Baalei Tosafos took place was because of the Ri Milunel's relationship with the Rambam, and I'll explain. The Rambam in his Yigeres Teiman, where he rails against people who say a time when Mashiach is coming, meaning there's many people who predict times when Mashiach is coming. The Rambam in Yigeres Teiman is strongly against it. He rails against it. He says it's a terrible thing. He brings the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Tipach Rucham Shemachash Vekitzim, and he strongly says that. But at the end of Yigeres Teiman, even the Rambam himself brings the Messiah that his family had about when Nevuah is going to come back to Klal Yisrael. And Kayidua, Nevuah has to come back to Klal Yisrael before the Geula could come. So the Rambam in his own way is like saying Epes HaCheshbon of something of when like when the Geula could come. Now if you do the math of the Rambam's Cheshbon that's at the end of Yigeres Teiman, it comes out to either 12:10 or 12:16, depending on two different ways how to read it. So this aliyah that the Ri Milunel, who was considered himself a Talmud of the Rambam, and Mishay Melechai made, was right during that spot, during that time period when, according to the Rambam's Cheshbon, the Rambam's family Messiah from the Goinim, Nevuah was going to come back. So there are those who suggest that the reason why the Ri Milunel was going up to Israel at this juncture of history, even though it was dangerous, like Rabbeinu Chaim Kohen says, and it wasn't something that was advisable, was because there was an idea that Geula was going to come around this time period. But whatever the reasons are, whether it was because of Stam, the Crusaders destroyed their communities in Europe, whether it's because of anti-Semitic rules that were passed against them in England, or whether it was because they were being mitzapel Yeshua, they were hoping Mashiach was going to come in this juncture in history. At that point in history, 300 from the Baalei Tosafos went up to Eretz Yisrael. Amongst them, some very famous Baalei Tosafos, like the Rash Mishantz, possibly his brother the Ritzvah, his son. Later on, Rechimli Pariz comes. So many famous Ashkenazi Rishonim make it up, and there becomes a big influence of Ashkenazi minhagim on the minig Eretz Yisrael. So to complicate an already complicated, dying minig, because minig Yisrael was wiped out the Crusaders, you have the insertion of the Baalei Tosafos, who come in and add a whole other layer of minhagim that are not native to Eretz Yisrael, that are a whole different set of minhagim. So after that, it's very hard to know what's what. If you see a minig in Eretz Yisrael, where does it come from? Where does this minig come from? Now, one of the main places where this murkiness about the Eretz Yisrael minhagim is relevant is by 2 days Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael. And so let me explain how. So the background of the sugi is as follows. We know in Bavel, in Galus where we have 2 days Yom Tov for every Yom Tov. Because it's sake of the Yom, we don't know when the Yom Tov really starts, and therefore we have 2 days Yom Tov. Now, we do know when the Yom Tov starts because we have calendars. We know exactly when the Yom Tov starts. So this starts way back when Klal Yisrael was Mekadosh L'Chodesh Al Pi Riyah. Now, the basic overview is Adam would have to have seen the moon at the time after when the moon arrives for the month. They would go to Bezdin HaGadol Yerushalayim. They'd be made about seeing the moon, and the Bezdin HaGadol would question them. They would figure out that this was a real sighting, and based on Bezdin HaGadol's assertion that this was a real sighting, Bezdin HaGadol Yerushalayim would be Mekadosh L'Chodesh. Now, the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah tells us, B'tchila hayomasi and masoyis. The way that they would spread the word about Rosh Chodesh having arrived is they would light a fire on top of a mountaintop in Yerushalayim, and messengers on each mountaintop where they could see from one to the next would light fires until there'd be fires lit all over Eretz Yisrael that would tell everybody in Eretz Yisrael that it was Rosh Hashanah, that it was Rosh Chodesh, and therefore everyone would know there was no need for 2 days Yom Tov. The message would get out quickly. It says, Mishakilkulu HaKusim, when the Kusim started messing up the system, they would add interference into the communication system that the Bezdin used, and they would light their own fires. So, Bezdin would send out shluchim, but the shluchim would only be able to reach to the furthest extents of Eretz Yisrael in time to get the message out as to when Rosh Chodesh was. So by the time any Yom Tov happened, Yom Tovim generally are a few days or maybe usually halfway through the month, so it was always in Eretz Yisrael, they always knew when Rosh Chodesh was, and they knew what the Yom Tov was supposed to be. But in Chutz La'aretz, where because of travel and it took a long time to get there, so it was yitachin that in a month like Nisan, you wouldn't know when Rosh Chodesh was until it was too late. So the takana was to have 2 days Yom Tov mishum sveika diyoma, and that was the takana. That's how it started. Now the reason why it still applies to us today is because the Gemara in Be'ah and the Alam in Be'ah brings down that even when this when this was gone, it says shalchu mitam. They sent the message hizaru b'minig aveseichem b'yadechem. Be careful to stick to the minhagim that your forefathers established. Why? Because zimnin the gazra malchus gzeira v'asilu kulkulei. The malchus could still make a gzeira, and your calendars that you think are so set and so established and so understood could end up becoming messed up. And therefore we stick to 2 days Yom Tov, even though there's not really a need to stick to 2 days Yom Tov anymore. That's the 2 days Yom Tov in Galus, mishum seika diyoma. Now the Gemara in Be'ah brings a machlekes. How we look at this? Is it looked at as kedusha achasein, which means yom ha'arichta? It's one long Yom Tov. When Chazal were masakin it, they made it like a takana. The takana was there should be 2 days Yom Tov. Or is it looked at as a suffix every time? There's a suffix. I'm not sure when Yom Tov is. Hey, there's a suffix. I keep both days. And this is nafkaminas la'alacha if you look at it as one vaday shtik Yom Tov. Yom Tov is just 2 days now. Or you look at it as a suffix Yom Tov with tzveika diyoma. Now, a basic nafkamina that's not so relevant to us anymore, but which is why it's in the sugya in Be'ah, would be an egg that's born on the first day of Yom Tov if you're allowed to eat it on the second day of Yom Tov. How do we look at these 2 days Yom Tov? Is it a continuation, or are they 2 days mishum suffix, and if one's Yom Tov, the other one's vadei chol? Okay, now in any case, this is the Bavel Dikadin of Sveika Diyoma with 2 days Yom Tov. Now in Eretz Yisrael, like we said, Hayos the Bezdin was able to get the word out in a much more efficient manner, in a quick fashion. Everybody knew, and there was no need to have 2 days Yom Tov, except for Rosh Hashanah. And that's as follows. That's because of this. The Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah, the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, the Flamin Beis, that says Mitchila hayim mekablen edus hachodesh kol hayom. Rosh Hashanah, the problem is that Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Hashanah, you need the information to come mamish in a quick fashion. Everything has to be very, very efficient for Rosh Hashanah to work. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the Flamin Beis, says Mitchila hayim mekablen edus kol hayom. They were mekabel edus the whole day of Rosh Hashanah, meaning someone could come even after Mincha time, kill mamish the end of the day of Rosh Hashanah already, and tell them that really you got it right. Today was Rosh Hashanah. They would accept that edus, and it will have been like Rosh Hashanah was. Meaning they would call it Lamed of. They would treat it as Rosh Hashanah, and even though the edim only came mamish, after Mincha when it was getting ready towards dusk, they would accept that as edus, and it would be called Rosh Hashanah. It says Pamachas Neskalku Alevim Bashir. The Edom came so late that the Levium said the wrong shir by the Tamid Shalbein Arbayim. By the afternoon Tamid, the Levium said the wrong shir. They said the shir of Chayil instead of the shir of Yom Tif, of Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, Hiskin, they were misakin that they cannot be Mekabeledis min Mincha L'mayla anymore. Only till Mincha can be Mekabeledis. And now the byproduct of this takana was that the Hiskin shir Yoyim Kodesh Ulamachar Kodesh. Today is going to be Rosh Hashanah, and tomorrow is going to be Rosh Hashanah also. Only in a case where the Edom came too late. Meaning if Edom show up after Mincha, so now it's going to be 2 days Yom Tif because the Edom came too late to make it Yom Tif. Now we're not disputing that really today was Yom Tif because the Edom showed up. So the first day of Rosh Hashanah was Rosh Hashanah, but you have 2 days Rosh Hashanah also. So now you have the invention of a 2 day Yom Tif for Eretz Yisrael. You have Rosh Hashanah, a 2 day Yom Tif for Eretz Yisrael. Because there are cases where Edom could come too late in the day, and therefore you're going to have to treat it like tomorrow's Yom Tif also. And on this, Heyosi was done bivadoyis, meaning it's not because of a suffix. Edom arrived, that everybody really knows that it is Yom Tif when it's Yom Tif. And Afal Pike in Chazal, the Bezdin Agadol was Masakin to have 2 days Yom Tif, so that is a din of Vadai. That's 2 days Yom Tif Mivadai. It's something unique about Rosh Hashanah, it's a Yom HaRichta. It's 2 days Vadai. Now, that's the core din. Let's take it a step further. Now, what happens Bizman Hazeh? Bizman Hazeh, we don't have Bezdin anymore, we don't have Kiddush HaChodesh Al Pi Ri anymore, we only have calendars, we have Cheshbainis. What's the din? Are there 2 days Yom Tov in Eretz Yisrael still or not? So there's a Gemara in Be'ah where there's a big need in the Manda Amrim in the Gemara, but at the end of the Gemara we have a Manda Amr who says as follows. We have a Manda Amr that says, here we go. Rava Amar, I'm sorry, so I left out a piece. So I'm sorry. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed and there was no more concern about Shira anymore, there was no concern about Neskalkal Levim Bashir, so it says Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that they could be Mekabel Eidus Kol Hayom. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, forget about the takana of not accepting Eidus after Mincha time, you could accept Eidus the whole day now. So he peeled back whatever the Bezdin Agadol did. So now the question becomes, once Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai peeled back the takana and said you could be Mekabel Eidus the whole day, L'chaira, the 2 days Yom Tif for Rosh Hashanah is not necessary anymore. Ravas, why do you have it? Mishum Sveika Diyoma, because you don't know if the guy will arrive on time. So it becomes like everybody else, like regular Rosh Hashanah of Galus. That would be one way to look at it. Now the Gemara over here says that Rava says, Afmi takanas of Yechon Mitzaka ve'elech, Bei Asura, because Mila Meidir Yechon Mitzaka Shembo Eidim and a Minchal Amayla Shanoig and Noisayim Kodesh Ulamachar Kodesh. The Gemara brings some Rava over here that even with the Yechon Mitzaka is takana, Yechon Mitzaka is maskim that there's still need for 2 days Yom Tov. That's what the Gemara says over here. Now, I don't want to get lost in the details of this. We have a basic picture of the breakdown of it. 2 days Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz, which is from sake of the Yema. In Eretz Yisrael, because Rosh Hashanah falls out in Rosh Chodesh, and there was a possibility that Edom could come too late in the day, Chazal or Masak in 2 days Yom Tov. Rav Yochanan Medzakai seemingly walks it back somewhat, but we have Rava at the end of the Gemara and Hayim and Beis and Beis seeming to say that even after Rav Yochanan Medzakai walked it back, there's still a reason for having 2 days Yom Tov. Albeit maybe only from sake of the Yom, maybe less of an intense 2 days Yom Tov than it used to be, but still there's 2 days Yom Tov. Now, based on this sugya, there arises a great machlekes rishonim. And it's a strange machlekes rishonim because it's a machlekes what the minig is, and nobody seems to know. The Rif, who lived in Algeria and in Spain, not in Eretz Yisrael, he writes as follows. He says, "V'shamina minei." We hear from this Gemara with Rava, "The bnei Eretz Yisrael tzrichen lemevet shnei yom tov Rosh Hashanah." We hear from Rava's din that even bezman hazeh, the bnei Eretz Yisrael have to make 2 days Rosh Hashanah. And Mamela, that's how it is. Like we know today, Taka, bnei Eretz Yisrael, they make 2 days Rosh Hashanah, and there's no difference by them. That's what the Rif says. Now, the Baalamar, who also didn't live in Eretz Yisrael, he writes as follows. He says, I saw in the Rif that he says this, but he says, that was all when they were being Mekadesh the Chodesh al pi Re'iyah. This that Rava says, that even after Re'echan and Zaka, you need to have 2 days of Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah, that's only Kolzman, they were still using the regular Bezdin system to be Mekadesh al-Chodesh, he says. But once that changed, at whatever point it is, and that's a great machlekes is when that changed, exactly when that changed. But somehow, towards the middle of the Tkufas HaMeiroim, it changes, and they start being Mekadesh al-Pi the calendar, completely al-Pi the calendar, no Bezdin anymore. Says the Rif, Aval b'deiris halalu me'acha shehutkan seder iber al-Pi haminig shenagu b'yadenu. Now that we have a calendar and everything is set up, Hari chazra kol Eretz Yisrael liyis kebeis avad she'ein lem safek b'kedushas hayom ve'ein chayavim lishmor ki im yoyim echad bein b'Rosh Hashanah bein b'shar yom tovim. Says the Baalamar, not true. Now that we have a calendar, this that Rava said to stick to 2 days, that was when they were doing it with Kiddush HaChodesh, with Bezdin. Once we have a calendar and that fell away, in Eretz Yisrael, it blives always like they have total clarity. Just like in Eretz Yisrael, back in the day when they had total clarity, they were able to keep 1 day of Yom Tov, like in the Beis Havad, like in the Beis HaMikdash, like where Bezdin was, everywhere blives like Beis Havad. Everything has total clarity now. 1 day Yom Tov in Eretz Yisrael. This is what the Baalamar says. Now, it's a interesting machlekes rishonim, because he's talking about rishonim who are writing in, let's say, I don't know, this is called the 1100s, they're writing, or the 1100s. Many, the Baalamars later, 1200s, whatever, many years later, hundreds or probably 1,000 years after the calendar was instituted, and they're discussing what is the minig in Eretz Yisrael, what does Eretz Yisrael have to do? Without it, so now the Baalamar tries to bring a raya. He says, I saw a tshuva from the Gaonim that says as follows, a letter from Rav Nissen Gaon to Rav Hai Gaon, that says, do Bnei Eretz Yisrael have to do 2 days Yom Tov or not? And the Gaonim seem to say that they don't have to do 2 days Yom Tov. They can do 1 day Yom Tov. So this is what the Baalamar brings. He brings Rabbeinu Ephraim, he brings Rabbeinu Nissim, and he argues on the Rif. Now he says, you want to know why today he says they have 2 days Yom Tov? 1 second, let me find you this line. Can't find it in a second, but he says as follows. He says, you want to know why today? He's aware of the fact that the minig in Eretz Yisrael is to have 2 days Yom Tov. The Baalamar is not disputing that what the Rif is saying is the actual minig to have 2 days Yom Tov in Eretz Yisrael. And Eretz Yisrael says, you want to know why they have 2 days Yom Tov? He says, Me'ikar adin taka from Vechon Mitzaka, they did not have to have, and they didn't have for 1,000 years. Ad shebo chachmei provençal, until these Rishonim came up from France and brought with them their minhagim of having 2 days Yom Tov. So and the Baalamar, this kilu, the whole thing that we said about Minig Eretz Yisrael and it being so unclear to know, and the Baalei Taisa's influence on it, the Baalamar and the Rif are Gufa arguing about the Minig of 2 days Yom Tov in Eretz Yisrael. Does it have to do with these Baalei Taisa's, with these arrivals from France who changed the Minhagim in Eretz Yisrael, or is this Mikori? This is the Iker Minig of Eretz Yisrael based on the Gemara and Beya. Now, this is a basic machlekes. Now, to us it makes no nafkamina really because we have 2 days Yom Tov in our Hashanah, and we treat it like a marichta. Zikr l'chumra, maybe even l'kula, which is like a whole need in the place that I'm not going to go into now. We zikr treat it like it's a takana to have 2 days Yom Tov, possibly even l'kula. There's Magen Avram that has yom marichta l'kula. Now, I just want to go into a small other detail of a varaya. Now, this is everyone knows now it's piyut season, right? This time of year is when we're saying piyutim. There's a lot of piyutim that are insertions into tefillah later insertions that we say, and one of the most famous paitanim that everyone's heard of is Rav Elazar HaKalir. He made a lot of the kinnis, a lot of the slichas, a lot of the piyutim that we say. Rav Elazar HaKalir is one of the most famous paitanim. Now, is it totally accepted? Everybody agrees. If Rav Elazar HaKalir writes it, it's heilig, put it in, say it, or is that something that's in dispute? Who was Rav Elazar HaKalir? When was it written? And what does this have to do with our 2 days of Hashanah? So I want to talk about this for a minute like this. The Even Ezra, in an extremely harsh and sharp critique, the Even Ezra writes in his pirush on Shir Hashirim, I think, or is it Kehelas? His pirush on Kehelas Hey, where the pasuk says, "Al teva'el es picha lachti es l'shayncha." Don't rush your mouth don't rush to speak quickly to cause your mouth to sin. He goes off on like a harsh critique of Rabbi Elazar HaKalir's piyutim in particular and piyutim in general. And he writes like strongly, he teaches the pasuk. He says, Al teva'el es picha v'libcha al yimar l'hoitzi davar l'fnei elikim. That's the pasuk he says. He says, he writes as follows, Chayiv adam kishi yispal sheyishmor pischei piv. You have to be very careful what comes out of your mouth. You're standing in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, could kill you, could give you life. You can't just say piyutim that you don't know the types of them. And then he goes off and he has 4 different critiques of the piyutim that are inserted by the Kalir and others. The kroivitz, the kroivos, or kroivitz, depends on how you call it. That's what they refer to, that were inserted by these Rishonim. He says, first of all, the diktik is terrible, the Lashon Kodesh is terrible. It goes, a lot of times it brings midrashim that are shalaik pshutim of the inyanim. He brings like critique after critique, and then he mamish says, strongly to stay away from these piyutim. Similarly, the Radak, elsewhere, another big Baal Diktuk of a similar tkufa to the Even Ezra, he also strongly critiques the piyutim of the Kalir. Now, others come to the defense of Rav Elazar HaKalir. Lamashal, some famous ones, the Maral, in I forgot which sefer, the Maral says that gerecht, you're right, that when you say tefillas, they're supposed to be accurate, and we're saying psukim, they have to be accurate. He says, but over here, you're talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu the way you talk. Piyutim are shir, v'shevach, they're a way to communicate, to express yourself, to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's done in the shigru delishna of people. Meaning, it's a beautiful tefillah. It's a way to modernize the tefillahs, to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way that's that you could understand, that you could express yourself. Now, he says, I saw that the Even Ezra Mamish spoke harshly on Kadmeneinu Rav Elazar HaKalir. How could one not think in his heart that what Frierdiker did must have been full of wisdom and chachma? And if you really pay attention to what the Kadmonim did, you'll see they didn't make mistakes even a little bit. I say don't pay attention to what Even Ezra says about this role. Just ignore him. Now this is benign compared to the critiques that others have in the Even Ezra. This is gentle. Reb Kveger, who was always gentle, uncharacteristically, is very harsh. In a letter that's really written discussing all defense of tefillah from the Reform movement, he says, "V'chein b'piyutim." He says, "Ein l'shanes hanusach shenoistu mikdoshe elyon." Don't change the nusach that the K'doshe Elyon made. Afsha Rav Even Ezra b'kehelas pasuk shmor ragelcha loag upar piv ala kalir k'vaydim k'ayim. He spoke harshly. He made jokes, and he went after the kalir. K'vaydim k'ayim munach ubezeh aser shloi k'hoygen. He didn't do it right over here. Shlifkaya b'chvayid hakadosh hazeh, to be pagay in the cover of this kaddish. And I'm going to skip a paragraph and come back to it in a second. And he says. He continues. He says, "Chalila v'chalila lishmay alay," to listen to him. Leilach b'nesivas and b'dilig. Don't pay attention. And the kalir shara lemara. He says he made terrible mistakes, and he should be ignored when it comes to his critique of the kalir. Now, Rebbe Kveger opens up this idea. The Maral says it in a vague sense. Kadmeinenu. Rebbe Kveger talks about it in a more specific way. Who was Rebbe Elazar Kalir? Who is this Kadmeinenu that we're referring to? So it's a fascinating thing. Tosafos, in 2 places in Shas, mentions Rebbe Elazar Kalir in very interesting context. The first place is the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the Chazayin and Aleph says, "Keman matzalinan hayoim." Who do we daven like today that we say hayoim harasaylem? On Rosh Hashanah we say today is hayoim harasaylem. It's the creation of the world. Now we know the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, and the Gemara also has a machlekes if benisa nivra elam or betishrei nivra elam. It's not so clear. So the Gemara says, "Keman matzalinan hayoim." Who are we davening like? Who's our nusach stimming like when we say hayoim harasaylem? And the Gemara says, "Rebbe Elazar, B'shua." It's a machlekes. It is what it is. Now in Tosafos brings that the piyutim that Rav Elazar Kalir wrote on Pesach, he seems to paskin like the Manda Amar that says Benisa Nivra Olam, because he says this is the creation point, and the piyutim that he wrote for Rosh Hashanah, he seems to say Hayom Harasailam is Rosh Hashanah time. So Tosafos discusses this kilu stira, and Tosafos in Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Zayin says, Omer Rabbeinu Tam, the elu ve'elu divrei elikim chayim. It's possible they're both true. One was the original machshava, and one is when it actually happened. So Tosafos brings the piyutim of Rabbi Elazar HaKalir to ask a stira in psak of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Elazar, and says, so you see, Tosafos is elevating Rabbi Elazar HaKalir to like an incredibly high level. Tosafos is assuming that if Rabbi Elazar HaKalir says something, it has together of like paskening, like Rabbi Yeshua, like Rabbi Elazar, and he's asking, like how you talking that Rabbi Elazar HaKalir could pasken like both of them. So here Tosafos is a little bit more vague. But in Tosafos in Chagiga and Daf Gimel is a fascinating Tosafos. The Gemara in Chagiga Daf Gimel says it's a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara in Daf Gimel talks about Nebuchadnezzar, who threatened HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it says he threatened. He says Ala Elal Bamsei of Edmel Elyon. Nebuchadnezzar said, like, I'm a match. I'll come up there and I'll settle this with you myself. Nebuchadnezzar said. And the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Yatzah Baskel v'Amra. Baskel came out and it says, Rasha ben Benoy shel Nimrod ha-Rasha, shehimrid kalayim kulay elav malchusay. It says, you Rasha ben Rasha, you Einikal of Nimrod, meaning because you're following in his footsteps. It says, Kama shnaysev shel Adam. How long do you think you're going to live already? Shivim Shana, 70 years. You know how long it's going to take you to get up to Shemayim? The Oivi of the Rakia takes 500 years to travel. Each one 500 years. The space between each one 500 years. The Chayis, the smaller Malachim, the Ragle Chayis, the Karsule Chayis, each one of them, the distance that it's going to take you to pass these mile markers in Shemayim is 500, 500, 500. Meaning you'll have to live hundreds or thousands of years to be able to even get up to Shemayim to challenge HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is like the mockery that the Baskel came out and it made about Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you do the math of how many 500 years it is, I think it's 15 sets of 500 years. Now, I'm quick. 15 sets of 500 years is, what do you say? So 7,500 years of travel that it takes to get to Shemayim. Now, there's a piyut that Rabbi Elazar HaKalir was masakin for Rosh Hashanah, where the math is off. The math in the piyut is not 7,500 years. It's a different number. It's a different number. Frek Tosafos, he says, Yesh Magiyim, there are those who Magiya, the piyut of the Kalir, because it doesn't add up with the math of this Gemara and Chagiga. It doesn't stem over here. And Tosafos says, V'yesh Leimar, that he was going like the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi has a slightly different cheshbon that stems better with his piyut. And he says, oftentimes you find that the Kalir could take the Yerushalmi's position over the Bavli's position. He says, and now Tosafos ends off and he says as follows, Shehu hayatana, because the Rabbi Elazar HaKalir was a Tana. V'hu hayir Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, the Kari Alei Mikol Avkas Reichel, Tana Kara Krevitz Python, Ubiyamav Mekachim Al Piyariya. One second, just so he says Rabbi Elazar HaKalir was a Tana, and therefore he could select between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. He's not meshubed to kilu our prioritization of the Bavli. He could select. That's Tosafos. So first of all, Tosafos gives Rabbi Elazar HaKalir the highest of highest statuses. It's not just like Stam. He was a Kadma and he was a Goyin. He was a Tana. Tosafos says, and Tosafos says as follows. And Ubiyamav, he says Mekachim Al Pi Re'iyah. In his days, they were Mekadosh Al Pi Re'iyah still Al Pi the Bezdin system. Shemei Olam La Yasad Rakovitz Miyem Echad. He only makes piyutim for one day. And this is the punchline that I wanted to get to. Rabbi Elazar HaKalir only has piyutim for one day, says Tosafos. Therefore, he was a Tana from an early stage when they were being Mekadosh HaChodesh with Riyah, and he only had one day Yom Tif. Now, here, so first of all, I just have to, first of all, Lamani Yediyah, today, with the Cairo Geniza and things that they found, there are piyutim for Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, more than one for Yom Tif. But I'm no expert in piyutim, but the Baalei piyut say that it's not really for 2 days Yom Tif, it's really for depending on what day of the week Yom Tif fell out. Meaning, based on what day of the week, how close to Shabbos it was, or a thing, like, I could barely read them, literally the Ivra, so I don't know, but there's a cheshbon, and it's not really for 2 days Yom Tif. Now, the kasha is, and this is a kasha that Rishaya Pick asks the Neidim Yehuda in a tshuva in Arachaim Tinyana, tshuva Kufiyud Gimel, he says, I don't understand. Tosafos says he only has piyutim for one day, so it's a riot that Kufi lived or who he was. I don't understand. Everyone knows that Rabbi Elazar HaKalir lived in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, they only had one day Yom Tif. What's the taina? You should make piyutim for Bavel that are 2 days Yom Tif from Sfeik the Yoma. They had one day Yom Tif. That's what Rabbi Elazar HaKalir makes, one day Yom Tif. What's the tzad? You should make 2 days Yom Tif. This is the Rishaya Pick. Ask this kasha to the Neidim Yehuda. And the Yehuda in his tshuva says that he says in his tshuva that the raya was from Rosh Hashanah. He says the raya from Rabbi Elazar HaKalir was Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael, he should have had 2 days Yom Tif, and therefore he should have made 2 piyutim for Rosh Hashanah. He doesn't. That's the raya that he lived at a time when there was Riyah and there's no 2 days Yom Tov. Like a very early stage in the Riyah when there's no 2 days Yom Tov. Now, Lamaisa, Tosafos says that he was a Tana, and the Reb in his letter against the Even Ezra strongly supports that side. But there were Chachamim, different Chaykrim throughout the Deiros, later Chachamim, even the Yavitz and the Chida and the Shuvas Zecher Yosef, who was Mechutanim with Rav Shayapik, and others, Wolf Hindenheim, like other Chachamim and Chaykrim of the later Dar, brought rayas that Rav Elazar Kalir was a later person. He lived more like in the Tkufa Sagainim, more in a later Tkufa. Now, the Na'id Yehuda's son at the end of the Tshuva puts a postscript and says, my father held that he was the Tana like Tosafos says, and was not nispal from any of the rayas that these people brought, and therefore, Misham Miktas Kashis, a little rayas that the Piyutim don't seem to stem with when Tosafos says to date it, he never saw the need to argue with Tosafos. So, the Na'id Yehuda seemed to have been of the opinion that Tosafos was correct, and this is how you have to assume Rav Elazar Kalir was. Other of the Gedolei Achronim were more open to the tzad that the dating could be different or whatever. Now, I don't know Piyut well enough to have an opinion about this B'chlal. I just want to say that Lu Yehei, that Rav Elazar Kalir lived during the Tkufa that these Achronim wanted to live, let's say, in the year 500 or 600, then we would have a good raya to the Machlekes the Balamar and the Rif if there was 2 days Yom Tov in Eretz Yisrael. Because if the Na'id Yehuda's premise is correct, that the reason why Tosafos is bringing anything from him is only about Rosh Hashanah, and Rosh Hashanah there would have had to have been 2 days Yom Tov, we could still have that same conversation in the year 600 also, and say, if the Rif is correct, that in Eretz Yisrael there was always 2 days Yom Tov, even after Bezin was long button, they would be Mekadosh Al Pi Cheshbon, you could say, what happened to the Kalir? Why is there not 2 days Yom Tov? Why is there not 2 Piyutim? At Lamai there was only 1 day Yom Tov. Now, again, I don't know enough to say one way or the other, but Halai Davarhu, that this Shaila and Piyut and Rav Elazar Kalir and Tosafos could play a role in this need in Ramach Lekes. Now, just one tiny postscript, and I'll wrap it up with this. There's a Grois Yadin in Piyut who says that even though Rav Elazar Kalir has no Piyutim for 2nd day Yom Tov for Rosh Hashanah, there's an interesting anomaly. In a Piyut that he made for the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, that's based on Eicha, he has charuz, like one line for every Yom Tov that was Nisvatal. Meaning the Yom Tov in the Beis HaMikdash, how beautiful they were, and how they were Nisvatal by the Churban. And each Yom Tov is, a 2-line, like a rhyme that says what was beautiful and what went away. For Rosh Hashanah, he has 2. Just interesting. Now, that's not B'mkoim having a second Piyut. Maybe you could say a second Piyut was lost. Really, there was 2. We lost one of them. It's like a diik bilvad that it exists, such a thing. Anyhow. Oh, the second one's Al Shchedesh?
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.